What's up, babes? It's Alex or Black Eye here. A few weeks ago, I did top 3 easiest gods to play in every class, and this week we are doing the inverse, top 3 hardest gods to play in every class. As always, before starting, I want to make a few clarifications. In the last video, some people requested that this list be Conquest specific rather than taking other game modes into account, so this video will be Conquest specific and won't take into account other game modes such as Joust, Arena, Assault, etc. This list would look a little bit different if I took other game modes into account. There isn't a specific order for the gods that I talk about, so for example, the first god I discuss I don't think is necessarily harder than the last god I discuss, and vice versa. There are biases at play. I'm biased, you're biased, your grandma's biased. I try to keep my biases in mind when making this, but regardless, they are still there. I'm also going to try my best to not take the current meta into account. It's easy to say that X god is easy or hard because they are either very strong or weak in the meta, and instead I'm going to opt more on focusing on the actual core gameplay loop of the character. And finally, this is just my opinion, it's all subjective, there isn't really a right or wrong answer. I know whenever topics like these are discussed, some people take it personally, and I promise it's really not that deep. Personally, I just think it's fun to talk about. Like the last video, we're going to begin with the assassins, specifically with Lancelot. Lancelot, in my opinion, is one of the highest skill ceiling assassins in the whole game. Lancelot just requires a lot of decision making, especially while you're on the horse, and on top of that is a very easy god to bait yourself with. While off the horse, his first ability requires auto attack canceling to utilize properly, which some people don't even know about, and the second ability is actually pretty straightforward. The third ability is also pretty straightforward, although I literally never see newer Lance players use the pivot while riding the horse. And also, while you're on the horse, I see a lot of new Lance players struggle to know which ability, either the first or second ability, to use to get off the horse. And finally, the ultimate, while it is a get out of jail free card, can also be difficult to aim at times, and a ton of players are reliant on the ultimate as an escape instead of using it to combo into your other abilities. Next up, we have Serket. While being one of the safest assassins with 2 different movement abilities, I think Serket is also one of the harder assassins to execute her kit with. This is also assuming you're in the jungle rather than in support, but in the jungle you don't really use any of her abilities for damage without using her second ability first. And when you do need to use her second ability, most newer Serket players struggle to hit them in general, much less hitting 2 different gods with a single cast of the ability like you'll see better Serket players do. Again, I want to reiterate that I do understand she is safer since she has 2 movement abilities, but one of these movement abilities is mainly used for damage, which again is pretty much only used for damage if you can hit the 2 unless there is other CC at play. She also struggles late game, especially in the jungle, because she gets blown up super easily. Using her 2-1 combo in the late game has you sitting in roughly one spot for multiple seconds, as well as when you can ult somebody, you are sitting there for even longer. Yeah, she's safe, but a conquest game is pretty difficult to win if your jungler isn't doing damage, and again, her damage is really hard to get off sometimes. Finally, we have Kleena. I really struggled figuring out whether I wanted to put Kleena or Set on this spot, but ultimately I chose Kleena. She has little CC in her kit, and not many people utilize her passive correctly, either choosing to stay on the wall way too long, or just simply forgetting that she could go into the walls. Similar to Lance, I also believe there is a much higher skill ceiling with Kleena compared to other assassins, again mainly because of the passive and the fact that you can literally cancel all CC and damage by going into a wall. On top of this, a big source of her damage is through her dash, which instantly makes her a bit harder than other gods because if you use your dash for damage, then you can't use her dash for an escape. Finally, free casting her ultimate for damage is generally pretty difficult without CC because it's pretty telegraphed and fairly narrow, so it's easy to dodge. Her first ability can be cancelled pretty easily, and her second ability, I feel like people forget that it is a conditional invisibility. I'll see a lot of people throw the 2 on one character, then walk at another, even though they aren't invisible to that second character. She does have really good objective shred, which is a positive, but overall, due to the other aspects I just discussed, I think she makes a top 3 for those reasons. I am going to put honorable mentions in every category, and for the assassin category, the honorable mentions are Set and Susanoo. Set because of similar reasons to Kleena and the existence of Shell, which is completely fucks over Set as a character, and Susanoo because of the various combos you need to learn to succeed with Susanoo. Next, let's move on to the Guardians. We'll start with Atlas. I feel like Atlas players fall into 2 categories. They either carry the game or do absolutely nothing. I think the difficulty comes with the timing of the abilities, because I'll see a lot of Atlas players just press their abilities off cooldown instead of waiting for the optimal time to, I guess, just use their abilities to maximize their potential. It's extremely easy to dodge the 1-2 combo, and many players will use either the same combo or just the 2 when there isn't any follow-up available. I also feel like some people struggle to realize that the ultimate is supposed to be used to reduce protections to help your team, instead of just sniping kills or using it solely for damage. Don't get me wrong, that is really fun to do, and there are situations where that is the correct thing to do. It's just not optimal in every single situation. And then we have his dash, and I feel like a lot of people just forget that it cleanses CC, and again, just use it for damage instead of helping out your team. Next up, we have Maui. Maui is a Guardian that excels when there is good communication between all of your teammates. But I'm pretty confident in saying that most people aren't in communication with every single teammate, at least vocally. At the top level of play, I believe Maui is one of the best Guardians in the entire game, while at the lower level of play, I think Maui is one of the most useless Guardians. He doesn't really have enough damage to kill people, assuming you are building him like a normal support, and relying on your teammates to follow up off of your CC can be miserable. Every single ability that Maui has, except for the ultimate, relies on some form of communication to have them be useful. There isn't a point in grabbing someone unless a teammate will follow up, and there isn't really a point in stunning somebody if your teammate also won't follow up. I get that you can still use the grab and the stun for peel, but you could say that about literally any Guardian and their abilities. And also, if I throw my 2 at somebody one more time, just for them to not go through it for safety and then die because of it, I'm just gonna end it all. Lastly, we have the ultimate, which is pretty fucking dope. It's not really that hard to use. I guess remembering you can use it to block off certain pathways can be difficult, but other than that, you just slap it down when a ton of people are grouped up. Overall, with Maui, I feel like the indirect requirement of good team communication just makes Maui a lot harder than other Guardians. Finally, we have Yamoja. Hardest Guardian in the game to play. No question about it. Literally every single ability except for the 2 is difficult to use properly. Knowing when to spam the 1 over and over instead of holding a certain type of CC can be difficult, and positioning yourself properly to use both the ultimate and the 3 to their fullest potential is probably the most difficult part of playing Yamoja. Even managing her Omi is inherently more difficult than other Guardians, because no other Guardian has Omi, and managing mana, in my experience, is just much easier than managing Omi usage. I truly feel like Yamoja is one of the few Guardians that can actually carry a game from support in the right hands, even if your damage dealers just aren't the greatest. But getting to that point where you can carry games on Yamoja takes a lot of skill and experience. The 2 honorable mentions for this category are Fafnir and Khepri. Fafnir because he's a lot more skill shot oriented, and Khepri because of similar reasons to Maui. Now we can move on to the Hunters, and before I talk about Hunters, I just want to say that making this list for Hunters was really fucking hard, because I truly believe every Hunter in the game is pretty easy to play. With most of the Hunters, you can find success with them just by aiming properly and holding down the auto attack button. With that being said, let's start with Anhur. Anhur can be very good in the right hands because of the higher skill ceiling. On top of all of this, while Anhur's 1v1 is a lot better than other Hunters' 1v1s, his clear, especially in the early game, is pretty rough. His kit is unique where it excels in both playing extremely aggressively and extremely defensively, and that applies to every single ability. Should you pillar near someone to slow them down and combo with the 2, or save it in case someone goes on you? Should you impale someone to try and deal damage, or save it for self-peel? Hell, should you leap on somebody to combo with the rest of your kit, or save it to jump away from the enemies? You could even say this with the ultimate, because a ton of people use the ultimate solely for CC immunity rather than damage. I just feel like Anhur is an all or nothing character. You can't really use part of his kit for peel and part of his kit for damage. You're either fully committing to being aggressive or fully committing to peeling for yourself or a teammate. There's also a couple smaller things that make him more difficult than other Hunters. For example, his pillar to impale combo is a bit harder than other Hunter combos in the game. And I don't see many people hitting every single spear of Anhur's ultimate without some form of crowd control. Next up, we have Heimdallr. When it comes to Heimdall, the biggest skill differential between good and bad players is the placement of his Bifrost crystals. I have a star on Heim, and I still sometimes forget to place a crystal down before a team fight. On top of all of this, Heimdallr's laning phase, especially in the early game, can be pretty goddamn rough. This might just entirely be a me thing, but I hate Heimdallr's early game, especially when it comes to his auto attacks. They just feel really bad until you get some attack speed online. His 1 is fairly straightforward, don't really need to talk about that. His 2 can be used for a variety of reasons though, but mainly for the knockup immunity and actual knockup itself. When it comes to his ultimate, you can literally get yourself killed if you aren't aware of the enemy's purification bead status. From my experience, Heim actually loses a good bit of 1v1s because some players fully commit to a kill using the ultimate, and then the enemy just uses beads and kills him. On top of this, his self-peel is a bit more complicated to pull off than other Hunters because of his 2, his 3, and again, his ultimate. Okay, you guys are gonna hate me for this, but I'm putting Uller in the top 3 most difficult hunters, solely because he is objectively the most mechanically difficult hunter in the game, and he has a lack of CC immunity. Yeah, there are smaller things here and there, such as using your abilities in a specific order to maximize the passive cooldown reduction, but with 3 actual skill shots on top of needing to hit auto attacks, if your mechanical ability isn't the best, then you will not find success with Uller. In the laning phase, I feel like prior to this year, Uller wasn't super rough until they nerfed the base damage of a few of his abilities, which made his clear a lot worse than some other hunters. Like I said at the start, he doesn't have CC immunity built into his kit, so it's a bit easier to get caught by multiple enemies if your beads aren't up. Hell, it's even easy to lose a 1v1 if your beads aren't up, especially if the enemy just beads your axe. I understand the whole, oh, just hit your axe and then the next 2 abilities aren't skill shots, but if you can't hit your axe, then you most likely won't be able to hit your other abilities as well without crowd control. Feel free to yell at me in the comments, I know people will be pissed, but overall I think Uller is just the most mechanically difficult hunter in the game, and lack of CC immunity makes him a bit trickier than other hunters. The honorable mentions for hunters are Ishtar and Danzaburou. Ishtar because of her combos and understanding of her first ability, and Danzaburou for positioning and counterplay reasons. Next we can move on to the mages, which is another category that was extremely hard to rank, mainly because there are just so fucking many mages and tons of them have completely unique playstyles that some might find easier than others. We'll begin with Hel. I think Hel is like the perfect combination of needing good mechanics, positioning, and game knowledge in order to succeed with her. Her wave clear is solid throughout the whole game, which gives her an edge over other mages, but other than that, she has 6 abilities, and I'd argue 4 of them require a bit more thinking than other mages, especially in her light stance. For starters, her first ability in light stance is one of the hardest abilities to hit in the game, especially on an ally, and I really don't know why. I just feel like there's a general consensus that Hel light stance 1 is really fucking hard to hit. And then her second ability in light stance requires pretty solid timing to either help yourself, an ally, or multiple people at the same time. Her third ability in light stance is pretty straightforward. Then we move on to her dark stance, which is a bit more straightforward than light stance, but still requires a bit more thinking than other mages, mainly because of her lack of mobility. Sure, it's easy to get her damage off, especially since her 2 slows the enemies, but I've seen Hels bait themselves countless times because they'll push up to get their damage off, then immediately get jumped by the other team. As I said earlier, to succeed with Hel against good players, you really need to have good mechanics, positioning, and game knowledge. Next up we have Merlin, which is another stance switcher. Stance switchers will be a pretty common pattern in this video. Not only do you need to understand Merlin's entire kit and combos to succeed with him, he also just struggles in the early game, which doesn't really help. Merlin really only starts to come online after like 3 or 4 items, and sometimes by that point in a conquest game, it's just too late. Outside of that, some people just struggle to know what stances are best to use in whatever situation they're in. Yeah, it's easy to understand the simple things like fire stance is the best for objective shred, or void stance is the best if many people are grouped up and right next to each other. But it goes a bit deeper than that once you start playing against better players. There are just so many little things you can do on Merlin to maximize potential that learning all of them right off the bat can be a bit overwhelming for some people. At least Merlin's Flicker is both an amazing and easy to understand ability, although the cooldown is pretty long, especially in the early game. Finally, we have Tiamat. Like Yamoja for the Guardians, I think Tiamat is just the hardest mage in Smite to play properly. Similar to Merlin, Tiamat really struggles in the early game and takes a few items before Tiamat can come online. But unlike Merlin, her abilities can actually be difficult to hit, at least in her mage stance. I rarely ever see people hit every single shot of her first ability, and I also rarely see people hit the stun on her second ability. When it comes to her rat stance, yes, I call it rat stance. Sue me. It's a bit more straightforward and follows pretty much the same combo in most situations. You jump in, press 2, 1, 4, then hope you don't get blown up. But like some other gods on this list, knowing when to jump in can be difficult for some people, especially in the early and late game. Early game you don't do much damage, so you could bait yourself by thinking you have more damage than you actually have. In late game it's very easy to think it's safe to jump in, and then you just get blown up by the other team. I haven't even mentioned her ultimate yet, and in mage stance especially can confuse a lot of people. Hell, even the split push minions can be difficult to know when to put down, because if you put them down and then start a team fight 10 seconds later, then you won't have your ultimate for said team fight. Even when you do have your ultimate, deciding between the Tornado and Minotaur isn't as straightforward as some people might think. I don't know, for me personally it's going to be hard to convince me that Tiamat isn't the hardest mage in the game to play. Honorable mentions for the mage category include Hebo and the Morrigan. Hebo because of positioning reasons, and the Morrigan solely due to her ultimate. Finally, we can move on to warriors, starting with Cuchulainn. Cuchulainn made my top 3 solely due to managing rage. Similar to Yamoja, Cuchulainn doesn't have mana, and almost every single Smite player is more used to managing mana rather than rage. His abilities are pretty straightforward, although if you can't combine them with your rage transformation, then he really won't do that much. And when you can combine them with your transformation, then knowing when to actually engage can be a bit difficult. While you do technically turn into a raid boss when you transform, I see a lot of overconfident Cuchulainns that think they can either tank more than they actually can, or output more damage than they actually can, and kill themselves in the process. I don't think he's as simple as dumping your entire kit and that's it. You have to know when to dump your whole kit, because transforming too early or too late can quite literally change an entire team fight. That being said, his laning phase is fairly decent compared to other warriors, especially against players that aren't used to laning against him, so he's got that going for him. Next up we have Osiris. Skill shots. Plain and simple. His first two abilities are absolutely essential when succeeding with Osiris and are harder to land than most traditional warrior abilities. He also suffers similarly to the Cuchulainn that we just talked about, and some Osiris players will get overconfident and bait themselves. It's a bit easier for Osai players to do this due to the lack of mobility. His only movement ability is his fucking ultimate, and if you're using it to escape, then, well, you can't really use it for damage and vice versa. I also feel like a lot of people forget about the anti-heal aspect of this ability. Fun fact, the anti-heal Osiris's ultimate applies is technically 1000% instead of 100% like most people think. I do not have a source on this, although I do remember hearing it in an Olympian meeting a few years ago. Anyways, Osiris has above average lane clear and boxing potential, but Osiris is also one of those gods where if he gets behind in farm, then he's much more miserable to play than other warriors. I understand you could say this about a lot of gods, but some suffer more than others in this aspect. Again, with his ultimate, if you are behind, you are more likely to use your ultimate as an escape, which means your overall damage output decreases pretty significantly. Although, Osiris isn't as miserable from behind as the next warrior we'll discuss, which is King Arthur. King Arthur, I feel like, is another god that people are going to get mad at me for, mainly because of the meme around Arthur where people say, to succeed with Arthur, just smash your face into your keyboard. While this may have been true at some point in Smite's history, that was more due to him being a top tier character rather than a commentary on how to actually play him. Arthur is unique in the sense that every ability will cause him to switch stances, which tons of people, especially newer players, will instantly find overwhelming upon trying to learn him. You have 8 different abilities you need to learn and understand how they combo into each other, and when to properly use them. I can see why some people don't find him as difficult as other people, but I cannot understand why people say that Arthur is easier than most of the other warriors. Like I talked about when transitioning from Osiris to King Arthur, I think King Arthur is the most miserable character in the game to play when you're behind. You 100% absolutely need to either be even with your lane opponent, wow that was a mouthful, or be ahead, or else you're just going to have a very rough experience playing King Arthur. The honorable mentions for the warrior category go to Achilles and Mulan. Achilles because of the pretty rough laning phase and positioning purposes, and Mulan because of the rough late game and mechanics. Thank you guys for watching, and again, I know that this entire video is subjective and other people's top 3 will differ from mine, so feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. As always, just keep it civil. Discussing this topic isn't that deep, and it's just for fun. This has been Black Eye. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.
Oh shit, pray them niggas go, hey. Oh, we sell the clowns around, it look like circus show, hey. This is not the album either, these are just some throwaways. This shit's still so cold when it drop, it's gonna be a motherfucking snow day. Hey, boy, it's good and you know